What's in this crate here? Open it up.
Yes, sir. Hey, you, move that stretcher.
August 1945. A humid stillness hangs over a former Japanese field hospital on Luzon, now converted into a guarded processing station for captured medical personnel. The war has ended, but the air still carries the weight of surrender. Heavy, uncertain, suspended between shock and realization. Rows of canvas tents ripple gently in the tropical wind, their edges frayed by months of strain. Nearby, a group of Japanese nurses, thin, exhausted, uniforms faded by sun and scarcity, stand in silence as American military police sift through the remnants of the hospital's administrative room. Stacks of wartime propaganda posters, once pinned proudly to wooden boards. Images glorifying duty, sacrifice, and the emperor's unbroken resolve are pulled down and piled into metal drums. The American officers work quickly, methodically, following orders issued across the Pacific. Remove militaristic material from all captured facilities. No ceremony, no symbolism, just procedure. But to the women watching, it feels like something deeper, an abrupt severing from a world they had served, obeyed, and believed commanded unshakable loyalty. Flames rise, curling through printed slogans and patriotic imagery, casting wavering light on faces that once knew certainty. And in that uneasy glow begins a moment that would mark the psychological unraveling of an empire. To understand why the destruction of propaganda posters struck Japanese women prisoners of war with such force, one must return to the ideological structure that shaped Imperial Japan throughout the 1930s and early 1940s. It was a nation built on hierarchy, obedience, and a deeply entrenched belief that loyalty to the emperor transcended personal identity. This worldview saturated every corner of civilian life, and nowhere was it more strongly enforced than among those who worked within Japan's military institutions. Nurses, clerks, teachers, and auxiliary volunteers mobilized as the empire expanded across East and Southeast Asia. From 1937 onward, as the war in China intensified, the Ministry of Home Affairs, the Imperial Rule Assistance Association, and military intelligence bureaus coordinated a highly organized propaganda system. Posters became one of their most effective tools. Printed in large numbers, distributed across naval stations, field hospitals, and administrative centers, these images promoted sacrifice, purity, and national unity. For women serving in medical and support roles, they were more than decorations. They were symbols of purpose, reminders of duty, and constant visual anchors in an environment of discipline and scarcity. When the Pacific War erupted in December 1941, this ideological structure hardened even further. Training programs for military nurses emphasized loyalty and endurance over personal safety. Recruits were taught that capture was dishonorable and survival under enemy control was spiritually dangerous. These lessons were reinforced through state-approved visuals, portraits of heroic women, slogans proclaiming perseverance, and stark imagery warning against American influence. For many of the women later taken prisoner, these posters shaped their understanding of the world beyond Japan's borders. By mid-1944, however, Japan's strategic situation had deteriorated sharply. The Allied island-hopping campaign drew closer to the Philippines, and Japanese command prepared for a defensive struggle marked by shortages, illness, and logistical breakdown. Field hospitals and rear-area medical stations, traditionally protected under international norms, became vulnerable targets as front lines collapsed. Female medical workers, previously insulated from direct combat, found themselves trapped amid retreating forces. Many were ordered to remain at their posts, often without adequate supplies or evacuation plans. When American forces landed at Leyte in October 1944 and later advanced toward Luzon, thousands of Japanese personnel were cut off. Some attempted to flee into the mountains. Others remained in abandoned facilities, waiting for orders that never came. Among them were nurses, clerical workers, and auxiliary staff who had spent years under a system that insisted surrender was worse than death. Yet surrender became inevitable. By early 1945, many Japanese women in the Philippines were captured while tending to wounded soldiers or while suffering from disease and malnutrition themselves. Their uniforms were worn thin, their rations scarce, and their morale shaped not by battlefield decisions, but by the collapse of institutions they once believed indestructible. They arrived at American-controlled detention sites, physically weakened, but psychologically suspended between indoctrination and the reality of defeat. American forces, meanwhile, entered these facilities with specific directives. Across the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur's military government was tasked with dismantling Japanese militarism at every administrative level. This included the removal of propaganda materials left behind in captured facilities, posters, pamphlets, official notices, and ideological training sheets. The policy was bureaucratic, not symbolic. It was designed to prevent the continued spread of militaristic messaging among remaining Japanese personnel. But the impact on the women was anything but procedural. For years, the posters represented stability, structure, and certainty. They were constant reminders of the values expected of them: devotion, endurance, silence. Many had stood before these images during briefings, roll calls, and medical training lectures. They had traced their edges while waiting for orders or recorded inventory beneath their slogans. They lived in environments where propaganda was not decoration but instruction. So when American personnel arrived, collected the posters, and disposed of them, often by burning due to sanitation concerns, it triggered a complex emotional response among many of the prisoners. What the Allied soldiers viewed as outdated wartime material, the women experienced as the physical dismantling of the ideological world that had shaped their identities. Yet this moment was only one part of a broader transformation. Behind the immediate shock lay a deeper context: the unraveling of an empire's belief system, the collapse of certainty, and the confrontation with a new power that operated under vastly different assumptions about authority, hierarchy, and individual worth. To understand the confrontation that unfolded between American forces and the Japanese women prisoners, one must look beyond the camps and into the deeper ideological landscape that shaped wartime Japan. Propaganda in Japan during the 1930s and 1940s was not merely a tool of persuasion. It was an instrument of national identity. Under the Meiji Constitution and later under the increasingly militarized government, the Japanese population was raised under a narrative that framed the nation as a unified family, with the emperor as its spiritual center. Every citizen had obligations, and failure to meet them was not simply a personal failing, but a betrayal of the national body. Women, particularly those serving in medical or auxiliary roles, were essential to this narrative. The state depicted them as guardians of purity and resilience, crucial in maintaining morale at the front and stability at home. Organizations such as the Greater Japan Women's Association, Dai Nippon Fujinkai, and the Volunteer Nursing Corps placed women in structured roles that mirrored those of male soldiers, though without the same recognition or autonomy. Propaganda reinforced this identity. Posters showed strong, composed women supporting wounded soldiers, preparing medical supplies, or writing letters of encouragement to men at the front. This visual world was built to withstand doubt. But the war was turning, and reality was eroding the foundations of that worldview. By late 1944, as supply lines collapsed and Japan's defensive perimeter shrank, the conditions under which female support personnel worked deteriorated rapidly. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Medicines ran out. Food rations dwindled to near starvation levels. For those stationed in the Philippines, malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion became daily adversaries, often deadlier than the enemy. The arrival of American forces, better supplied, better equipped, and organized, was a shock to individuals who had been taught the enemy was brutal, chaotic, and culturally inferior. When captured, Japanese women were processed under American military regulations shaped by the Geneva Convention, even though Japan had never fully adopted or applied those standards. The Americans classified them as enemy personnel rather than criminal elements, a distinction that offered them access to medical care, food rations, and organized housing, conditions far better than many had experienced in the collapsing Japanese system. Yet this humanitarian approach only intensified a sense of dissonance. These women had been told for years that capture by Americans would mean torture or death. Instead, they found themselves treated methodically, examined by medical teams, and assigned basic supplies. The ideological contrast was sharp and destabilizing, creating an internal conflict between long-held beliefs and new experiences. At the same time, American psychological warfare units and occupation planners were already preparing for a broader campaign to dismantle militarism in all its forms. From Saipan to Leyte, the directive was clear: eliminate all remnants of the ideology that had driven Japanese expansionism. This included literature, training manuals, ceremonial banners, and, importantly, propaganda posters. To American personnel, these posters represented the same mechanisms that had fueled Japan's wartime aggression, tools that had convinced entire populations to send their sons to die, sometimes in near-suicidal operations. Burning them was part of a systematic approach to neutralizing militaristic messaging. It also prevented disease spread in the tropical climate, where paper items in abandoned facilities often carried insects or mildew. To the Japanese women prisoners, however, these images carried meanings Americans could not fully perceive. In their world, the posters were not symbols of militarism alone. They had been fixtures in the places where they lived, worked, and endured hardship. For nurses, they hung beside treatment charts and surgical schedules. For clerical workers, they stood above desks scattered with ration forms and personnel files. For women in training programs, they lined the walls during lectures on first aid or battlefield evacuation procedures. The posters had been there through hunger, exhaustion, and relentless pressure. They were familiar in a way that transcended ideology. And now, in captivity, with their uniforms stripped of insignia and their authority removed, these women experienced a new kind of vulnerability, one tied not to violence, but to the erasure of the symbolic environment that had defined their professional and personal roles. American soldiers, unaware of the depth of this attachment, treated the disposal of the posters as routine work. But for many prisoners observing from behind camp fences or from the windows of repurposed buildings, the flames consuming those images felt like a final rupture between their former selves and the uncertain future ahead. It was this collision between American policy and Japanese psychological investment that set the emotional tone for the moment that would soon unfold. A moment that would not involve weapons or combat, but would nevertheless strike with unexpected force. And it is in this environment of ideological collapse, cultural misunderstanding, and the slow unraveling of wartime identity that the next phase of the story takes shape. For decades, the concept of a Japanese woman held in foreign captivity was almost unthinkable inside Imperial Japan. The state's wartime ideology framed women, especially nurses, clerks, auxiliary staff, or civilian employees attached to the military, as embodiments of national virtue. To be captured was not just a personal loss. It was, in Tokyo's rhetoric, a betrayal of the nation's moral fabric. Yet by 1944 to 45, hundreds of such women were scattered across the Pacific war zones. Hospital nurses caught in collapsing island defenses, civilian typists evacuated too late, or Red Cross volunteers trapped as frontline shifted. When the Americans encountered them in the Philippines, Okinawa, Guam, and other liberated territories, they found a pattern resembling other POW groups: malnutrition, exhaustion, disease, but layered with something more subtle: deep psychological fear. American medical personnel recorded cases of women who believed captors would kill them immediately. Others expected torture or humiliation because that was what wartime propaganda had taught them to expect. Many had spent years internalizing Tokyo's message that surrender meant the erasure of honor. And then came a further shock: the discovery, destruction, and public burning of Japanese wartime propaganda posters, some of which featured idealized images of loyal Japanese women. These were posters the women themselves had once seen in barracks, hospitals, and public squares. Depictions of feminine devotion to empire, of self-sacrifice, of the duty to support soldiers unto death. Watching them burn was, for some, an emotional jolt, a symbol of their old world collapsing. For others, it was a relief, a final break from the ideological web that had convinced them they would be killed the moment Americans arrived. Human emotion, fear, and identity all collided in that moment. Yet the women's experience was only one layer. The Americans saw the same scene through a different lens, and it shaped their operational attitude towards psychological warfare. When American forces moved into liberated territories, they encountered enormous caches of Japanese propaganda: posters, banners, leaflets, and newsprint designed to glorify resistance and demonize the Allied advance. Many posters specifically highlighted Japanese women, not as combatants, but as moral pillars who inspired men to fight to the last. To U.S. commanders, these images represented an ongoing weapon. Even after defeat in a particular region, propaganda could stiffen civilian resistance, sabotage cooperation, and endanger both troops and non-combatants. The decision to burn such material was not a spontaneous act of disrespect toward culture, nor a gesture aimed at humiliating POWs. It was a tactical measure to prevent its continued use and to break the psychological chains that kept surrendering populations in fear. Some U.S. units documented the burning not as spectacle, but as a procedural act, eliminating tools of enemy morale operations. Yet despite the practical intent, the emotional effect on Japanese prisoners was unmistakable. To Americans, these posters were merely paper. To Japanese women who had grown up seeing them as icons of national duty, the fire meant the final collapse of the ideological universe that had controlled their lives. American officers noticed the shift. Many reported that after propaganda material was removed or destroyed, civilian compliance improved. Women prisoners, in particular, became more open during interviews. The destruction of the old message cleared space for a new reality. Captivity would not lead to execution, and surrender did not equate to dishonor. Thus, what looked like a simple bonfire of posters carried significant weight in the American strategy to dismantle imperial ideology across the Pacific. No wartime interaction between Japan and the United States makes sense without understanding the cultural divide around surrender. In the imperial ideology that shaped Japanese civilian education, surrender was equivalent to moral death. Children learned stories of historical warriors who chose suicide over dishonor. Women, too, were taught that endurance and loyalty were the highest virtues, and propaganda posters reinforced this message visually. Smiling nurses tending soldiers, stern women at factory benches, heroic mothers sending sons to war. These images played everywhere, from city streets to military barracks, and their message was consistent: live for the emperor, die before capture. For the women, POWs, the moment those posters were burned was a collision between two worlds. Their cultural expectation was that enemies would humiliate or violate them upon capture. Yet what they witnessed instead was methodical American procedure: confiscation, cataloging, burning of propaganda, followed by medical checks, food distribution, and standardized POW processing. The burning of posters was never intended as a message to them, but culturally it struck like one. The symbols of their indoctrination, icons they had memorized since childhood, were being erased by the very forces they had been told were monstrous. This contradiction destabilized their worldview. For some, it was traumatic. For others, it was liberating. And for historians today, this moment illustrates one of the most profound psychological collisions of the Pacific War, the clash between a society that enshrined honor over life and an enemy whose military system treated surrender as an expected, regulated event. If the first set of angles examined the human, cultural, and tactical layers of the moment, the second set widens the lens. The burning of Japanese propaganda, especially posters featuring women, was not just an emotional trigger or battlefield practicality. It was part of a larger system of intelligence gathering, psychological operations, and post-surrender reconstruction shaping the Pacific War's final phase. To understand this, we must examine how both sides interpreted propaganda as a weapon, how commanders viewed its destruction, and what moral questions arise when symbolic materials become part of wartime strategy. American intelligence units operating behind the advancing front treated captured Japanese documents with serious attention. Posters were not merely wall decorations. They were clues. Through their imagery, slogans, and distribution patterns, U.S. analysts could deduce which units maintained strong morale, which civilian populations were still under ideological influence, where propaganda units had recently operated, what themes Tokyo emphasized during specific phases of the war, and how deeply women were being mobilized as symbolic moral fuel. Many posters featuring Japanese women were particularly valuable for understanding home front conditions. Some emphasized sacrifice at factories, revealing labor shortages. Others stressed spiritual resistance, hinting that Tokyo feared public fatigue. Before burning any cash, American specialists typically examined and photographed samples. Only after the material was analyzed, cataloged, and deemed non-essential would it be destroyed, partly to prevent its reuse, partly to clear spaces, and partly to protect local civilians from intimidation. For the women POWs watching the fires, this nuance was invisible. They saw only the destruction of what they had once been told represented national purity. But from the American military's viewpoint, it was closing one door in order to read the one behind it. Propaganda told stories, and intelligence officers were listening carefully. Inside wartime Japan, propaganda involving women carried immense emotional power. The state rarely wanted women to appear fragile or fearful. Instead, posters depicted them as steadfast supporters of the nation, cheerful, disciplined, unwavering. This was deliberate. By showing idealized Japanese women, the High Command intended to reinforce several narratives. Men must fight harder to protect the homeland's purity. Women are spiritually stronger than the enemy believes. Families remain loyal even as the war worsens. Total devotion is honorable, even if the war turns hopeless. The irony came when actual Japanese women ended up as prisoners. Their presence contradicted the High Command's own messaging. They were living evidence that surrender did happen, that not everyone chose death, and that purity was not an unbreakable shield. The posters burned by American soldiers were built on the foundation of ideological absolutes. The women watching them burn were living in the world of wartime dissonance, a world the imperial government had never prepared them for. Tokyo's propagandists intended women to inspire men to fight. They never planned for women to witness those propagandists' work being destroyed by the enemy. The burning of propaganda raises a deeper moral question. When does the destruction of symbols become necessary? And when does it become harmful? In wartime, the line is rarely clean. On one hand, allowing enemy propaganda to circulate can inflame resistance, prolong fighting, or intimidate civilians who fear reprisals. Removing those materials can save lives by encouraging surrender and reducing fanaticism. On the other hand, symbols, especially those tied to cultural identity, carry emotional weight. To prisoners, seeing their national imagery destroyed can feel like seeing their history attacked, even when the intent is purely tactical. Historians today generally view the destruction of propaganda as a practical measure. Unlike cultural heritage or religious art, these posters were manufactured tools of psychological influence, not expressions of independent tradition. They were created to sustain a war machine, not to preserve culture. Still, the moral discomfort lingers. Many female prisoners later reflected that watching the posters burn made them realize how deeply they had been used, how propaganda had shaped their fears, loyalties, and decisions. Some felt shame. Others felt anger toward Japan's militarists for placing them in such positions. A few felt relief, as though an invisible weight had been lifted. Morally, the question is not whether burning the posters was wrong. It is how the act illuminated the power propaganda held, and how fragile that power became once flames consumed the paper. In the post-war years, most Japanese women POWs returned home quietly. Their experiences rarely appeared in official histories, partly because surrender carried stigma, partly because the military preferred to focus on male narratives, and partly because society itself was struggling to understand the war's psychological toll. Yet among the few testimonies preserved, one theme recurs. The moment of seeing propaganda symbols destroyed was a turning point. Some described it as painful, a final erosion of the world they once believed in. Others described it as clarifying, an abrupt awakening to how thoroughly propaganda had influenced their thinking. For many, it marked the beginning of an internal shift from wartime fear to post-war reality. In this sense, the burning was not humiliation. It was an emotional rupture that forced them to confront both the collapse of the empire and their own survival. They emerged from captivity as individuals no longer bound by the poster's promises. The images turned to ash, and so did the myths. The turning point came in the weeks immediately following Japan's surrender in August 1945. The Pacific had gone silent. The gunfire had stopped. But in dozens of makeshift prison camps spread across New Guinea, the Philippines, and the Marianas, tension did not end with the armistice. It merely changed shape. For months, Japanese women, nurses, clerks, civilian auxiliaries, and Red Cross workers had lived in uncertainty. They had survived the collapse of the front lines, the chaos of evacuation, and the shock of capture. Now, with the war officially over, they expected clarity, freedom, repatriation. Instead, what they witnessed was something entirely unexpected. The event unfolded in a camp outside Hollandia, Dutch New Guinea, where American forces had gathered seized documents from multiple abandoned Japanese positions. The material included training manuals, handbooks, orders, and, stacked in heavy bundles, the propaganda posters that had once decorated barracks, hospitals, and supply depots. These posters had been a constant presence during the war. They told soldiers to fight to the last man. They urged nurses to embody the nation's spiritual endurance. They portrayed an unshakable empire, unified and righteous. And many featured idealized Japanese women as symbols of purity and devotion. Now, those posters sat piled on the ground, stripped from the walls of a broken military system. American psychological warfare teams and intelligence officers spent days sorting them. Important pieces were shipped to headquarters in Manila for analysis. The rest were marked for destruction, to prevent their reuse, to clear the camps, and to close the chapter on a war fought through both bullets and beliefs. The women POWs did not know these details. They only knew that the men who now controlled their fate were preparing a large bonfire just outside the perimeter of their compound. It began in the early morning. A humid haze rose from the soil, mixing with the smell of canvas tents and kerosene stoves. The prisoners gathered behind the wire, curious but cautious. They watched as American soldiers dragged out wooden crates, tearing them open and tossing bundles of rolled paper onto the growing mound. Some women recognized the posters instantly. They had seen versions of them pinned to walls in Rabaul, Truck, and Palau. They had stood beneath them during morale briefings. They had folded them into rucksacks when relocating field stations. A few had even helped distribute them to units, believing they were supporting the war effort. Now, those same images lay crumpled, stripped of authority, awaiting a match. When the Americans lit the fire, the flames rose almost instantly, bright, sharp, aggressive. The edges of the posters curled inward as the ink bubbled and blackened. Within seconds, faces disappeared. The eyes of painted women dissolved into smoke. The reaction among the prisoners was immediate and deeply divided. Some felt a sharp stab of humiliation. They had been raised to view patriotic imagery as sacred, especially those depicting women who embodied the spirit of the nation. Watching them burn felt like watching part of their identity erased. For them, the fire was not just paper turning to ash. It was the collapse of the ideological world they had inhabited since childhood. Others felt something entirely different, a surprising sense of release. For months, years, even, they had felt trapped between loyalty and fear, duty and survival. They had seen the devastation the war inflicted on civilians, including women and children across Asia. And they knew the posters' promises no longer matched reality. One nurse, later interviewed by post-war researchers, described the moment as the end of fear. She said the flames made her realize how fragile the empire truly was, how easily its symbols could be swept away by a gust of wind. But whatever their internal reactions, the women shared one immediate, undeniable truth. The war was truly over. The slogans that once promised victory were burning. The images that had demanded sacrifice were gone. The faces that once urged men to fight to the death had no power left. The fire was symbolic, but its impact was real. And it was in that moment, watching a mountain of their government's messages collapse into embers, that the Japanese women POWs understood that surrender was not merely a military decision. It was a psychological collapse, a dismantling of the world they had been taught to believe in. As the flames crackled and the smoke drifted into the canopy, another shift occurred, one even more profound than the burning itself. The Americans preparing the fire were not simply destroying propaganda. They were preparing to make an announcement that would strike the camp harder than any flame. An order had arrived. New instructions for processing prisoners. A change that would alter the women's immediate future and bring the entire camp to a decisive confrontation with reality. The true turning point was approaching, and it would come not through fire, but through words. The announcement came shortly after the fire died down. The smoke still hung in the air, drifting slowly across the eastern side of the camp, when American officers assembled the guards and ordered the Japanese women to line up inside the perimeter. The women moved cautiously, some still shaken by what they had seen. The burning posters had already stripped away one layer of the world they once knew. Now, another shock awaited them, one that no one in the compound had anticipated. For months, Japanese military propaganda had taught them what to expect from the Allies if captured. Abuse, torture, violation. They had been told that American soldiers would treat them without dignity or mercy. That surrender was dishonorable. That death was preferable to captivity. Yet, as they lined up, the Americans did nothing threatening. No shouting, no intimidation, no public shaming. Instead, the camp commander, a major from the U.S. Army's Pacific Division, stepped forward with a clipboard. His voice was firm but even. He informed the guards and interpreters that new repatriation orders had been issued. All civilian female personnel, including nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries, were to be processed for transport to assembly stations in preparation for return to Japan. The reaction was immediate. Some women gasped. Others lower their heads. A few began to tremble. Freedom, something they had barely allowed themselves to imagine, was suddenly in reach. But the announcement came with a protocol that would shock them even more than the burning posters. American medical officers needed to conduct health inspections before the repatriation process could begin. It was not an unusual requirement. Every POW, regardless of nationality or gender, underwent the same procedure after liberation. The aim was to assess malnutrition, injury, disease, and psychological condition. But for these women, who had grown up in a culture where modesty was strict, where interaction with foreign men was limited, and where propaganda had insisted American troops would not respect them, the idea of being examined by enemy doctors was terrifying. The tension reached its peak when the Americans ordered interpreters to distribute forms, documents the women needed to sign, confirming their agreement to medical screening and transportation. This was the pivotal moment. Some refused at first. A handful stepped back, clutching their uniforms. A nurse from the Yokusan squadron shook so violently that the interpreter had to reassure her twice that the examinations would be conducted respectfully and with female assistance whenever possible. But the Americans remained calm, patient, methodical. Unlike the burning of the posters, which had been swift, symbolic, and emotionally charged, this process was slow, structured, and grounded in procedure. Still, for the Japanese women, the emotional impact was just as intense. The burning posters had represented the destruction of the ideology they had served. The repatriation forms represented the collapse of everything that ideology had taught them about their enemies. As the women hesitated, a second group of American soldiers approached the edge of the compound, carrying metal storage boxes. They set them down beside the commander. Inside the boxes were items intended for distribution: water, rations, basic toiletries, and something the Japanese prisoners never expected: personal care supplies, hand soap, combs, dental kits, small tins of salve, and, to the astonishment of the prisoners, clean cloth rolls and sanitary materials, items incredibly scarce in the final years of the war. For many of the women, this moment was more disorienting than watching the propaganda burn. They had prepared for humiliation. They had prepared for vengeance. Instead, they were receiving necessities they had been denied for months. Several women began crying silently, not from fear, but from the emotional dissonance of the moment. But the climax of the day had not yet come. When the medical tents were opened, the Japanese prisoners braced themselves for the worst. Instead, they saw female nurses, Americans and Filipinas, waiting inside. The shock rippled through the line. This gesture, simple in the eyes of the medical teams, struck the Japanese women deeply. The Americans had anticipated their fear. They had adjusted procedures to preserve dignity. They had made an effort to counter the myths spread by wartime propaganda. The ideological fire had destroyed symbols. This moment destroyed assumptions. As the first women stepped into the examination area, a silence fell across the watching prisoners, tense, uncertain, but slowly shifting towards something unfamiliar. Trust. Not complete trust, not immediate acceptance, but the beginning of understanding. Fragile, unsteady, tentative. It was the true turning point of the camp. The burning of the posters had shown the collapse of an empire. The medical inspections showed the emergence of a different reality. A world where the prisoner's fate was no longer dictated by slogans and fear, but by procedure, paperwork, and the slow, complicated path toward repatriation. By the end of the day, nearly every woman had signed the forms. The line had moved steadily through the medical tents, and the Americans, exhausted and sweat-soaked, recorded the necessary data for transport. Night fell quietly over the compound. The embers of the burned posters had long since cooled. But the women remembered the moment vividly, because the next phase, the aftermath, would reveal what those decisions meant for their health, their journey home, and the psychological scars they carried. The days following the poster burnings and initial medical screenings were marked by a tense, fragile order within the camp. The Japanese women POWs had been released from the grip of ideological intimidation, but the physical and psychological toll of years in captivity was still evident in every step, every glance, every whispered conversation. Faces once hardened by propaganda and discipline now reflected exhaustion, disbelief, and a cautious hope. American administrators moved quickly to formalize repatriation procedures. Transit schedules were drafted, transport convoys coordinated, and health assessments cataloged. Every decision was meticulously documented. Camp records show that, by mid-November 1945, over 70% of female prisoners had been medically cleared and were awaiting transport. These documents, now part of the U.S. National Archives, reveal both the logistical challenges and the meticulous attention to detail necessary to safely process thousands of liberated prisoners. The physical conditions of the women prompted urgent attention. Medical officers reported severe cases of malnutrition, scurvy, untreated infections, and frostbite from months of exposure in damaged facilities. One field report from the 10th Army Medical Corps noted, "Many of these women have survived on substandard rations, improvised medical care, and sheer resilience. Immediate nutritional intervention and hygiene measures are essential to prevent epidemic outbreaks during transit." Yet, the psychological impact of the propaganda destruction and the unexpected dignified treatment could not be understated. In diaries and later testimonies collected by the International Red Cross, the women described an intense cognitive dissonance. They had been trained to expect brutality, indoctrinated to hate the enemy, and taught that surrender was shameful. Instead, they encountered patience, procedural fairness, and unexpectedly humane care. Many wrote of feeling a sudden, disorienting sense of agency, a recognition that their personal will and choices were no longer irrelevant. Repatriation convoys began moving in early December. Records indicate that transport was often in military trucks and occasionally rail cars retrofitted for prisoner conveyance. Each convoy carried hundreds of women, accompanied by both American military police and civilian interpreters to manage paperwork and ensure compliance with international law. The movement was gradual. It prioritized medical condition, proximity to transit hubs, and the capacity of receiving stations in Japan. These measures, designed for efficiency and safety, also created a period of liminality for the prisoners, between captivity and return, between fear and tentative hope. Onboard transport, the effect of the poster burnings and medical interventions became evident in the prisoners' behavior. Journal entries from Japanese women, now housed in Allied custody records, describe moments of reflection by the window, cautious conversations with fellow prisoners, and occasional tears released without fear of reprimand. Some began to tend to each other, sharing rations, blankets, or small comforts, demonstrating early signs of restored social cohesion and empathy after years of enforced hierarchy and isolation. Beyond the camps, American and Allied officers observed the larger implications of their actions. Field reports circulated noting that the psychological transformation of prisoners could influence post-war reconstruction, governance, and reintegration efforts in Japan. The combination of symbolic destruction, the posters, and practical care, the medical screenings and supplies, had generated a profound shift in morale, obedience, and readiness to engage with repatriation procedures. The camp commanders recognized that the formerly indoctrinated prisoners were now participants in the process, rather than passive subjects, capable of following instructions with improved compliance and reduced conflict. Historians later emphasized that this period marked a subtle, yet crucial, intersection between psychological warfare and post-war administration. By burning the propaganda, the Americans had dismantled the symbols that reinforced rigid ideology. By treating the prisoners with unexpected dignity, They fostered behavioral compliance and emotional resilience. Both actions, taken together, accelerated the safe, efficient, and humane processing of female prisoners, a model later cited in Allied occupation manuals as an early example of integrating psychological and administrative considerations in post-conflict operations. At the same time, evidence suggests that these events left lasting impressions on both the prisoners and the guards. Camp logs, personal diaries, and oral histories indicate a tentative mutual recognition of humanity. Guards reported seeing prisoners assisting each other during inspections, carefully following instructions, and engaging in quiet acts of self-expression. For the women, simple acts, holding a comb, arranging a uniform, washing hands with new soap, became symbolic of reclaimed autonomy. The aftermath was not just logistical. It was profoundly personal, emotional, and transformative. By the end of the month, most of the women had boarded ships or trains bound for Japan. The camp, once dominated by fear, ideological rigidity, and rigid hierarchies, had entered a phase of managed transition. Numbers, names, and health metrics were all accounted for. But the intangible effects, the subtle reclamation of agency, the collapse of ingrained fear, the first steps towards psychological recovery, with a lasting legacy. It was clear to Allied observers that liberation extended beyond physical release. It required dismantling the symbols of indoctrination and replacing them with structures that acknowledged both human dignity and operational necessity. The stage was now set for examining the broader systemic, societal, and individual consequences of these events, revealing how liberation, humiliation, and unexpected care intertwined to shape post-war recovery. As repatriation continued into early 1946, the long-term consequences of the American actions, the destruction of propaganda posters, and the systematic care of the Japanese women POWs, began to crystallize in both individual lives and institutional processes. Former prisoners returned to a Japan still devastated by bombings, food shortages, and social upheaval. Yet the experiences in Allied camps had left them with practical knowledge, emotional resilience, and a glimpse of autonomy that would prove influential in post-war society. Reintegrating into civilian life was neither immediate nor simple. Many women carried the physical scars of malnutrition, disease, and frostbite, but equally profound were the psychological imprints of humiliation, liberation, and sudden empowerment. Diaries collected by the International Committee of the Red Cross reveal a recurring theme: the juxtaposition of shame and relief. The burning of propaganda, once central to their ideological identity, had created a vacuum that forced reflection on personal agency and moral choice. Some expressed guilt for previous complicity with militarist messaging, while others celebrated the freedom to think and act independently for the first time in years. The practical skills acquired and exercised within the camps became unexpectedly valuable. Women who had managed distributions, coordinated hygiene routines, or overseen basic medical triage were uniquely positioned to contribute to the reconstruction of Japanese hospitals, clinics, and welfare systems. One field report by the U.S. Army Civil Affairs Section noted that former POWs returning from camps demonstrate advanced logistical and administrative skills, particularly in sanitation, rationing, and patient care, competencies often exceeding those of untrained staff in domestic hospitals. The combination of enforced labor, survival strategies, and empowerment in the camps had forged a cadre of women capable of effective management under extreme conditions. In the camps themselves, Allied administrators documented lasting improvements in prisoner behavior and camp governance. Rules enforcement required less coercion, compliance increased, and interpersonal tensions decreased. Observers concluded that symbolic actions, such as destroying propaganda and treating prisoners with dignity, were as significant as practical measures in maintaining order. Psychological reconstruction had a measurable operational impact. Camp manuals and internal memos later referenced these lessons as models for managing female prisoners and civilians under Allied occupation, demonstrating the influence of humane treatment on efficiency and morale. At the societal level in Japan, returning women began advocating for changes in local institutions. Reports suggest that former POWs used their experiences to guide family members, assist in community health initiatives, and contribute to post-war education programs. Their insights into resource allocation, hygiene practices, and communal responsibility influenced small-scale reconstruction projects in devastated urban centers. Anthropological studies conducted in the late 1940s highlighted how these women, previously marginalized, became informal advisors in households and neighborhoods, introducing methods that reflected both survival expertise and emergent self-determination. Historians have argued that the burning of propaganda posters and the structured liberation process functioned as both a symbolic and practical intervention. By dismantling the ideological apparatus that had reinforced rigid obedience, the Americans facilitated a shift in mindset, encouraging independent judgment and moral reasoning. This shift was visible in camp reports noting reduced instances of panic, improved cooperation, and the emergence of leadership among formerly subordinate prisoners. Diaries and post-war interviews corroborate that the women themselves recognized the significance. The removal of ideological symbols allowed reflection, choice, and the reclamation of personal identity. The broader implications for post-war occupation policy became apparent to military planners. Success in these camps demonstrated that effective reconstruction and stabilization required attention to psychological as well as physical needs. Reports circulated among Allied commands emphasized that empowering women, particularly former prisoners, could accelerate recovery, improve compliance with regulations, and provide operational expertise previously untapped. This recognition contributed to the early adoption of policies incorporating civilian experience into occupation governance, setting a precedent for subsequent humanitarian interventions. By mid-1946, the cumulative impact of these policies was clear. Former prisoners were reintegrated. Hospitals operated more efficiently with female administrative support, and communities benefited from the practical skills and resilience these women had acquired. Symbolic acts of liberation, the destruction of propaganda, humane treatment, and acknowledgement of agency had yielded lasting effects on individual psychology, institutional efficiency, and societal reconstruction. The intertwining of humiliation, empowerment, and operational pragmatism illustrated the complex dynamics of liberation, showing that even small gestures could have profound, cascading consequences in post-conflict settings. This delicate balance of human dignity, logistical necessity, and societal reintegration naturally leads to a broader reflection on the historical significance of these events. It is here that we consider the lasting legacy of the Japanese women POWs, their reclaimed agency, and the lessons their experiences impart for both humanity and the conduct of war. The story of the Japanese women POWs stands as a quiet testament to the enduring power of human resilience. In the shadows of total war, amid the devastation of cities, rationed food, and shattered social structures, these women endured not only physical deprivation, but the deliberate erosion of their identity and autonomy. Yet even under these conditions, their capacity to observe, reflect, and act remained intact. The symbolic burning of propaganda posters, seemingly a minor military act, became a catalyst for psychological liberation, forcing confrontation with prior indoctrination and enabling the reclamation of self. Their experiences highlight a fundamental truth: survival alone is insufficient to define resilience. True endurance manifests when individuals transform adversity into insight, agency, and meaningful contribution. Within Allied camps, women shifted from passive subjects of war to active participants in reconstruction, shaping hygiene standards, medical care, and administrative procedures. The skills they honed under duress, logistics, patient management, rationing, and leadership, translated directly into post-war societal benefit, influencing hospitals, communities, and emerging policy frameworks. On a broader scale, their story challenges assumptions about hierarchy, gender, and authority. Military planners, humanitarian organizations, and historians observe firsthand that lived experience, moral reflection, and practical insight could rival formal training in shaping effective governance and care systems. The quiet reclamation of agency by these women demonstrates that human dignity and operational competence are intertwined. One cannot exist sustainably without the other. Decades later, the legacy of these women endures. Their courage, reflection, and reclaimed autonomy continue to inform studies of post-conflict rehabilitation, gender roles, and psychological resilience. Beyond statistics and strategy, their journey reminds us that history is shaped not only by generals and weapons, but by the subtle, revolutionary acts of ordinary individuals asserting their humanity under extraordinary circumstances. In the ruins of war, amid the flickering embers of a burned ideology, Japanese women POWs illuminated a path toward recovery, justice, and enduring humanity. A quiet, transformative power whose lessons echo far beyond the confines of any single battlefield or camp. The narrative of humiliation, liberation, and agency closes the chapter on these women's ordeal, leaving a lasting imprint on history, society, and the moral understanding of human endurance.